MH370 lost contact with Subang Air Traffic Control this morning.
When the pilot of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 spoke his final words,
Malaysia 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysia 370.
no one imagined they would become a haunting echo that would reverberate through history.
Air traffic control lost contact with the plane about 2 hours after takeoff.
One of the biggest jetliners there is just disappeared.
Within minutes, the massive jet vanished into the darkness, leaving 239 souls and countless questions behind. What began as a routine journey soon spiraled into a mystery so vast and chilling that it would rewrite the boundaries of aviation and human understanding.
How can you lose a jetliner? How can it vanish in thin air?
The night that waited. Malaysia Airlines Flight. MH370 was supposed to be a simple overnight journey. It was scheduled for the early hours of March 8, 2014, from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. Nothing about the flight seemed unusual. The aircraft, a Boeing 777-200ER with the registration number 9MMRO, had been in service since 2002 and had already completed more than 53,000 hours in the air. The Boeing 777 was known throughout the aviation world as one of the safest and most dependable passenger aircraft ever built. It was equipped with advanced technology that constantly reported its status to the airline and air traffic control. No one could have imagined that such an aircraft could ever simply disappear into thin air. On that quiet Saturday morning, 239 people boarded the flight. There were 227 passengers and 12 crew members. Among them were Chinese families returning home from holidays, Malaysian business travelers heading to meetings, and students making their way back to universities. 2 infants were on board, resting peacefully in their parents' arms. 5 young men were traveling on Iranian passports, a detail that would draw international attention later. Interpol would confirm that they were asylum seekers hoping to reach Europe, not criminals or terrorists. Each passenger carried their own hopes, plans, and destinations. None could have known how their journey would end. The captain in command was Zahari Ahmad Shah, aged 53. Zahari was a senior pilot who had served with Malaysia Airlines for 33 years. His first officer that night was Farik Abdul Hamid, aged just 27. It was his first long-haul flight as an unsupervised co-pilot, a moment of great pride in his career. Together, they performed their pre-flight checks. Every switch, every system, and every instrument reading showed that the aircraft was ready. Everything looked perfect. Weather forecasts for the route over the South China Sea predicted clear skies and calm winds. There were no signs of storms or turbulence. At 12:41 a.m., Flight MH370 began its takeoff from runway 32R at Kuala Lumpur International Airport. The engines roared to full power as the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted smoothly into the night. The lights of Kuala Lumpur faded below as the plane climbed steadily toward its cruising altitude. Controllers in Kuala Lumpur followed its progress on radar and noted that the climb was completely normal. At 12:42 a.m., Captain Zahari's voice came through the radio. He said clearly and calmly, "Malaysian 370 maintaining flight level 350. It was a standard report confirming that the aircraft was cruising at 35,000 feet. Inside the cabin, the mood was peaceful. The seatbelt signs switched off, and passengers began to relax. Some leaned back to sleep, others opened books, and a few chatted quietly. Flight attendants started the meal service, moving gently through the aisles. Everything felt as routine as it always did on long night flights. At 1:07 a.m., the aircraft's ACARS system, which automatically sends technical and performance updates, transmitted a routine report to Malaysia Airlines Operations Center. All readings appeared normal. The next update, expected 30 minutes later, never arrived. It was a small detail, easy to overlook at first, but later that missed message would mark the moment when something began to go wrong. Vanished without warning. At 1:19 a.m., Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control instructed flight MH370 to contact Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh Control as it crossed into Vietnamese airspace. This was a routine step that took place every night, with hundreds of flights making the same handover without issue. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah acknowledged the instruction in a calm, steady voice. His tone was professional, composed, and entirely ordinary. It was the kind of acknowledgement that controllers heard countless times a day. Yet, in the days that followed, those final words would take on a chilling importance. They would become the final known communication from MH370, and when investigators later replayed the recording, that calm, measured voice would stun them. It carried no hint of distress, no urgency, and no sign that anything was wrong. No one could have guessed that within seconds of that reply, something was about to go terribly wrong. The radar screen inside Kuala Lumpur's control center showed the aircraft's icon moving smoothly northeast, leaving Malaysian airspace. Controllers expected it to reappear almost immediately on Vietnam's radar systems. That was what always happened. But this time, it did not. At 1:21 a.m., the aircraft's transponder went silent. The transponder is a vital system that automatically sends signals containing the aircraft's position, altitude, and identity to radar stations. When it stopped transmitting, the radar display lost all identifying information about the aircraft. Controllers initially believed it was a normal gap that sometimes occurred during airspace transfers. Such gaps usually lasted only a few seconds. But as the minutes passed and no signal reappeared on Vietnam's radar, uncertainty began to grow. 10 minutes went by, then 20. Still, there was no radio call from MH370 and no radar return. Controllers in Ho Chi Minh City tried repeatedly to contact the flight on multiple radio frequencies, including emergency channels that pilots are trained to monitor at all times. Each call was met with silence. Other nearby aircraft were asked to try to make contact, but none received a response. Between 1:30 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., Kuala Lumpur and Ho Chi Minh controllers exchanged a series of increasingly urgent messages. They checked and rechecked their systems, convinced there must be a technical glitch. "Malaysian 370, do you read?" The Vietnamese side called again. There was no answer. The two control centers began to realize that they were not dealing with a simple communication problem. The aircraft had vanished from radar completely. Malaysia Airlines Dispatch Center was notified. They attempted to reach the aircraft using satellite data links that were supposed to connect automatically, even if radio communication failed. The attempts produced nothing. No connection, no signal, no data. The airline's operations manager was alerted, and efforts to trace the flight intensified. Almost an hour passed before officials began to understand that MH370 was not just out of contact, it was missing. At 2:40 a.m., Malaysia Airlines declared an alert phase, the first step in emergency response procedures. This meant that communication with the aircraft had been lost for an abnormal period of time. Controllers in the airline hoped it was only a systems failure, something that would soon resolve itself. But as more minutes passed without any sign of contact, hope began to fade. By 5:30 a.m., with no radar trace, no radio communication, and no satellite data, the situation escalated to a full distress phase, the highest level of emergency under international aviation rules. Search and rescue operations were immediately launched. Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and China sent aircraft and naval vessels to sweep the South China Sea along MH370's intended route. Dozens of ships and planes searched the waters where the aircraft was last seen, scanning for debris, oil slicks, or emergency beacon signals. They found nothing, not a single trace. No floating debris, no life jackets, no oil on the surface, no emergency beacon. The sea was empty. The lack of any signal was beyond explanation. Modern aircraft are designed with several independent communication systems. Even if one system failed, at least one other should have remained active. For every one of those systems to go silent at once would have required either a deliberate manual shutdown or an extreme catastrophic event that disabled them all in seconds. By sunrise, confusion had turned into disbelief. Engineers, air traffic officials, and aviation experts struggled to make sense of what had happened. If MH370 had suffered a disaster, there should have been distress signals, debris, or an automatic emergency transmission. Yet there was nothing. If the plane had not crashed, the question became far more troubling. Where could it have gone? That question would drive investigators to look beyond radar and reason, toward data buried in military networks and satellites orbiting high above the Earth. The turnback. 2 days after Flight MH370 vanished, the Royal Malaysian Air Force released radar data that changed everything investigators thought they knew. Until then, authorities had believed the aircraft continued northeast toward Vietnam before suffering a sudden and unexplained failure. But the new military recordings told a different story. They revealed that only minutes after its final voice transmission, the aircraft made a deliberate, controlled left turn. Almost a complete 180-degree reversal, and began flying back across the Malaysian peninsula. This revelation sent a wave of shock through the investigation team. The radar trace showed MH370 passing near the coastal city of Kota Baru, crossing the Malaysian mainland and heading out again over the Penang Strait. From there, it continued northwest along the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Its altitude shifted between 31,000 and 35,000 feet, movements that indicated the aircraft was being flown manually. It was not falling from the sky or drifting aimlessly under autopilot. Someone was clearly guiding it. The radar contact continued until 2:22 a.m., when the signal disappeared just off the western coast of Penang Island. That point would later become one of the most critical in the investigation, marking the last known military radar detection of the aircraft. What stunned investigators was how deliberate the flight path appeared to be. The turns were clean and precise, and the speeds were consistent with controlled flight. There was no sign of a system failure or a desperate struggle in the cockpit. Experts soon noticed another disturbing pattern. The route the aircraft took appeared to weave through known radar gaps between Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Each turn and altitude change seemed designed to avoid detection. These were not random maneuvers. Whoever was flying the aircraft understood the region's radar coverage well enough to stay hidden. That detail alone forced investigators to consider the most unsettling possibility that the disappearance had not been an accident at all. For the first time, the investigation began to focus on the idea that MH370 had been deliberately diverted. The question was by whom and for what reason. Every possibility was explored. Some investigators wondered if the plane had been hijacked, either by a passenger or by someone who had forced their way into the cockpit. Yet none of the usual signs of hijacking were present. There had been no distress calls, no attempt to communicate, and no demands made to authorities. No terrorist organization stepped forward to claim responsibility, and no ransom message was ever received. As international pressure grew, Malaysian officials widened the search area. They moved from the South China Sea to the Andaman Sea and the Indian Ocean, areas stretching thousands of kilometers from the flight's intended path. Each new development seemed to push the mystery further from explanation. The deeper investigators looked, the less sense it made. It was around this time that attention turned to data from commercial satellites orbiting high above the Earth. Analysts wanted to know if any signals had been recorded from the aircraft after it vanished from radar. This led to a crucial breakthrough. Engineers from a British company called Inmarsat discovered something that no one had thought to check before. Their satellite network had received a series of faint, automated handshakes from MH370's systems, long after it had disappeared from radar coverage. These handshakes were short, routine electronic exchanges between the plane and the satellite network. They did not contain flight data or location details, but they proved that the aircraft's satellite communication system was still powered on for several hours after radar contact was lost. This meant that MH370 had continued flying deep into the night, far beyond Southeast Asia. As investigators analyzed the timing and signal strength of those handshakes, a new and startling picture began to form. The data suggested that the aircraft had traveled thousands of kilometers southwest into one of the most remote and empty regions on Earth, the southern Indian Ocean. This was an area so vast and isolated that even ships rarely passed through it. The discovery stunned investigators once again. The evidence now showed that the flight had not crashed soon after contact was lost, but had continued on a long and silent journey across the sky. The question was no longer only where the aircraft had gone, but why. To better understand what could have caused such a controlled and intentional deviation, investigators turned their attention back to the cockpit, searching for clues in the lives and actions of the men who had been at the controls when the world lost sight of flight MH370. The men behind the controls. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah was not an ordinary pilot. He was one of Malaysia Airlines' most experienced commanders, with 18,365 flight hours and certifications on several aircraft types. Within the airline, he was regarded as a senior figure and a mentor to younger pilots. Colleagues described him as intelligent, disciplined, and technically skilled. They often said that if anyone could handle a crisis in the air, it would be him. Zahari's passion for flying went beyond his professional duties. At home, he had built a full flight simulator equipped with multiple computer screens and professional software that accurately reproduced the systems of the Boeing 777. He would often spend hours on it, practicing approaches, long-haul routes, and even complex failures, simply out of fascination with aircraft operations. After flight MH370 disappeared, investigators searched for any clue that might explain what had happened. When authorities entered Zahari's home, they seized the simulator and began analyzing its hard drives. Forensic experts from Malaysia and the United States worked together to recover deleted files and examine every recorded flight path. Among the many test flights he had run, they found several manually plotted routes. One of these routes showed a flight path that closely matched what satellite data would later suggest happened to MH370. A long, arcing journey southward over the Indian Ocean that ended when the simulated aircraft ran out of fuel. Investigators were careful with their interpretation. They explained that flight simulations are often used by pilots to test different possibilities and do not necessarily reflect real-world intent. Zahari's simulator contained hundreds of route variations, including short test flights and technical practice runs. However, the similarity between that one simulated path and the aircraft's suspected final route was difficult to ignore. It became one of the most discussed findings of the entire investigation, and for many, it marked the first time the focus turned seriously toward the cockpit. Away from aviation, Captain Zahari's personal life had become more complex. His wife and children had recently moved out of their family home, though the reasons were never made public. Friends said he had become quieter and more private, though still polite and professional at work. He continued to carry out his duties with precision, showing no visible signs of distress in the days leading up to the flight. Still, those close to him noticed a man who seemed deeply thoughtful, sometimes lost in reflection. On the day of the flight, political news in Malaysia had taken a troubling turn. Opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, a figure Zahari openly supported, had been sentenced to prison earlier that same day. Colleagues later recalled that Zahari had expressed disappointment over the verdict, though there was no sign of anger or instability. Investigators examined the possibility of a connection between his political feelings and the disappearance, but no direct link was ever established. First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid presented an entirely different picture. At 27 years old, he was at the beginning of what promised to be a bright career. He was deeply religious, newly engaged, and excited about his future. Fariq had joined Malaysia Airlines in 2007 and had trained diligently for years to reach this point. The flight on March 8th was his first long-haul mission as an independent co-pilot on the Boeing 777, something he had worked hard to achieve. His friends described him as cheerful, focused, and proud of his work. When investigators examined his personal history, they found nothing unusual. No evidence of stress, conflict, or motive that could explain any deliberate wrongdoing. The Malaysian Police Special Branch carried out one of the most extensive background investigations in the country's aviation history. They interviewed 170 people, including family members, colleagues, and friends of both pilots and other crew members. They reviewed financial records, phone data, and psychological assessments. None of the information uncovered showed a terrorist connection, a financial motive, or a psychological condition strong enough to justify a deliberate act of harm. Despite the lack of clear motive, experts could not dismiss the evidence of human control during the early stages of the disappearance. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, which later led the international search effort, concluded that the aircraft's early turns and altitude changes were consistent with manual input. Someone had been at the controls. Yet without solid evidence of who or why, the conclusion remained open. The report avoided placing blame, acknowledging only that human action was likely involved. Still, the calm and measured final words of Captain Zahari when he acknowledged the air traffic control handover at 1:19 a.m. continued to linger in the minds of investigators. Those words, spoken with absolute composure, would later stun experts. They revealed no trace of emotion or urgency, yet came only minutes before the aircraft made its unexplained turn. Many investigators would come to believe that those few seconds of audio held more weight than anyone first realized. But before those final words could be fully understood, investigators turned their focus to another mystery: the signals from the satellite data that had revealed that the aircraft had continued to fly for hours after disappearing from radar, long after the world believed it had fallen. That revelation would change everything and launch a new kind of search. The search that devoured oceans. After plotting the timing and angle of each ping, investigators created what became known as the seventh arc. This arc was a broad, sweeping curve that represented all the possible locations where MH370 could have been each time it communicated with the satellite. The calculations indicated that the aircraft had eventually run out of fuel at approximately 8:19 a.m., several thousand kilometers from its intended route. The area defined by the seventh arc was enormous, stretching from the waters near Indonesia to the icy, uninhabited stretches southwest of Australia. Coordinating the international response fell to the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, which deployed search vessels, aircraft, and submarines from more than 20 nations. The scale of the effort was unprecedented, and the task was made even more difficult by the extreme depth and remoteness of the ocean in this region. Search teams relied on sonar-equipped ships and deep-sea autonomous vehicles capable of mapping areas of the ocean floor that had never been surveyed before. During these missions, they discovered natural formations, previously unknown geological features, and even long-lost shipwrecks. But no trace of MH370 appeared. At these depths, pressures exceeded 6,000 meters of water, crushing any conventional submersible and complicating the search for the missing Boeing 777. The scale of the operation was staggering. The team was trying to locate a fuselage on a seabed roughly the size of the country of Greece. After more than a year of exhaustive searching, a breakthrough came in July 2015. A flaperon, a part of a Boeing 777 wing, washed ashore on Reunion Island, east of Madagascar. Serial numbers confirmed immediately that it belonged to MH370. Over the following months, additional fragments were recovered from the African coast and islands in the western Indian Ocean, including cabin panels, parts of stabilizers, and internal fittings. Ocean drift studies conducted by the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization confirmed that these pieces had originated in the southern Indian Ocean, consistent with the satellite-derived trajectory. Despite these discoveries, the main wreckage of MH370 and its critical flight recorders, the so-called black boxes, remained missing. By January 2017, after nearly 3 years of intensive searching, the official tripartite investigation involving Australia, Malaysia, and China was suspended. For the families of the 239 people on board, this suspension provided neither closure nor answers. The grief of uncertainty persisted, deep and unrelenting. Yet even as governments paused, private analysts continued. And in their data, the final spoken words of the pilot took on new weight. The last words. The final radio exchange between Kuala Lumpur and MH370 happened at 1:19 a.m. The controller gave a standard instruction. Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night. Captain Zahari replied, calm and steady, Good night, Malaysian 370. Those 5 words were the last ever heard from the aircraft. 2 minutes later, at 1:21 a.m., the transponder went silent. The ACAR's data link was already offline. From that moment, MH370 vanished from civilian radar. No distress call, no warning, nothing. It was as if the aircraft had been erased from the sky. Investigators have replayed that short exchange countless times. The tone was professional, controlled, and completely ordinary. Too ordinary. There was no hint of tension or technical trouble, yet the timing was chilling. The words were spoken at the exact moment the plane left Malaysian airspace and seconds before its tracking systems were cut. If those words were deliberate, they were the perfect cover for a calculated disappearance. If not, they were a haunting coincidence that marked the start of aviation's most enduring mystery. Experts still debate whether Zahari was performing a routine sign-off or delivering a quiet goodbye that no one recognized. The 239 people behind the cockpit may have already sensed something was wrong. The cabin lights dimmed. The jet banked off course. Passengers would have noticed the change in direction, the flight path that made no sense, and the eerie lack of announcements. Families and experts have imagined those final minutes again and again, the confusion, the fear, the realization that something was terribly wrong. More than a decade later, those 5 calm words echo through every investigation. The sky gave no warning, the ocean gave no answers, and the world is still listening for a reply that never came. What do you think about those last words? Comment down below.